The Anarchist Prophets, Godwin and Stirner. Part 1. What is anarchism? At the heart of the idea of anarchy lies the deep-rooted resistance to having one's life and actions ordered by others. Writing to his son Christopher in 1943, J.R.R. Tolkien remarked that my political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs. The most improper job of any man, even saints, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. While anarchism may be practically instantiated in the earliest human societies, anarchism as a self-conscious political creed is a recent development. George Woodcock writes that anarchism's peculiar combination of moral visions with a radical criticism of society only begins to emerge in a perceptible form after the collapse of the medieval order. Earlier movements, whether that of the Peasants' Revolt or Anabaptism, focused on a kind of egalitarianism, but not necessarily on individualism. Historians of anarchism tend to fall into the error of assuming that the primitive or medieval folk community, based on mutual aid and roughly egalitarian by nature, is also individualistic. More frequently, of course, it is the reverse, inclined towards a traditional pattern in which conformity is expected and the exceptional resented. In contrast to Woodcock, John Bowl is inclined to see anarchism as having a longer pedigree. Some manifestations of anarchism appear in classical and medieval times. The first stirring of the individualism characteristic of anarchism begins to appear in late medieval Italy. Anarchist tendencies manifest themselves in a religious mode during the Reformation, and then in an increasingly secular mode in Godwin, Fourier, Owen and Proudhon, Sorel and Kropotkin. Albert Meltzer takes an even longer focus than Bowl, noting that what might be called the anarchist approach goes back into antiquity, and that we can see an anarchism of sorts in the peasant movements that struggle against state oppression over the centuries. Whatever the precise details, I think it can be accepted that anarchistic tendencies were present in various degrees in various societies before the self-conscious elaboration of anarchism as a political doctrine in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Among the best known of the 19th century anarchists are Peter Kropotkin, Michael Bakunin, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Stirner. But as one might expect, there are many other thinkers to whom that description could with some degree of accuracy be attached, ranging from the 17th century proto-anarchist Gerard Winstanley and the 18th century radical William Godwin, a self-described non-anarchist, to the contemporary Noam Chomsky and Murray Bookchin. As with most interesting philosophical concepts, very little is uncontroversial about anarchism. For historical reasons, anarchism has perhaps been most associated with socialist or quasi-socialist movements, so that, as Novak puts it, anarchism is opposed to private ownership of land and capital. If this is so, then the term cannot be used by those who are not opposed to private ownership of natural resources or capital. The caricature of the anarchist as the bomb-throwing bearded Russian leftist is not without some remote foundation in fact. But I think it fair to say that the common public understanding of anarchism is that it is predominantly, if not exclusively, a left-wing doctrine, and one associated with those inclined to engage in what is sometimes euphemistically referred to as direct action. The activity of the British rioters of August 2011 were repeatedly referred to by the electronic and print media as being instances of anarchy. To provide a better understanding of what libertarian anarchism is, I would like to show it in relation to the broader anarchist family. We'll see that all forms of anarchism have in common their rejection of the state, but differ from one another primarily in respect of the position they adopt towards the implications of liberty and, in particular, in their attitude towards the nature, role, and legitimacy of property in human society. In contradistinction to the relaxed approach I take here to the appropriate use of the term anarchism, some give an account of anarchism that is severely circumscribed. Meltzer, for example, is unwilling to characterize Godwin and Proudhon as anything other than precursors of anarchism, and he denies the commonly held opinion that Bakunin was the founding father of anarchism, pointing out that his conversion to anarchism was a late development. Meltzer's harshest words, however, are reserved for those who believe there can be such a thing as anarcho-capitalism or libertarian anarchy. He writes, "Common sense shows that any capitalist society might dispense with a state in the American sense of the word, but it could not dispense with organized government or a privatized form of it if there were people amassing money and others working to amass it for them. The philosophy of anarcho-capitalism dreamed up by the libertarian New Right has nothing to do with anarchism as known by the anarchist movement proper. What they, the anarcho-capitalists, believe in is in fact a limited state, that is, one in which the state has one function, to protect the ruling class, does not interfere with exploitation, and comes as cheap as possible for the ruling class. On this way of looking at things, anarcho-capitalism simply cannot be anarchism because capitalism and the state are inextricably linked, the first giving rise to the second, or vice versa, or because capitalism necessarily exhibits domineering hierarchical structures such as that between employer and employee. I have a certain sympathy with Meltzer here. Not much, but some. The term capitalism carries so much emotional and conceptually confusing baggage, either positive or negative depending on your point of view, that it can scarcely be used in a neutral or descriptive way. Murray Rothbard tried to make conceptual space for the term anarcho-capitalism by distinguishing two different kinds of capitalism, remarking that the term capitalism was coined by its greatest and most famous enemy, Karl Marx, but that what Marx and later writers have done is to lump together two extremely different and even contradictory concepts and actions under the same portmanteau term. These contradictory concepts Rothbard styles free market capitalism and state capitalism, and the difference between them is precisely the difference between, on the one hand, peaceful, voluntary exchange, and on the other, violent expropriation. David Osterfeld makes essentially the same point when he distinguishes between economic capitalism and sociological capitalism. Economic capitalism signifies production according to the dictates of the market, whereas sociological capitalism is defined in terms of the ownership of the means of production by the bourgeois or ruling class. Sociological capitalism finds expression in reality as what is often called mercantilism, which is the incestuous relationship between big business, banking and government, a position which has been vehemently excoriated in both its historic and in its current manifestations. Free market defenders of capitalism have economic capitalism in mind when engaged in their defence of it, and are not only not committed to a defence of sociological capitalism, but are in fact resolutely opposed to it. Needless to say, failure to keep these two very different accounts of capitalism apart has led to much confusion, and critics and opponents of capitalism talked past each other when many were in basic agreement. Walter Block distinguishes between what he calls corporate state monopoly capitalism and anarcho or laissez-faire capitalism, and remarks that these two systems are as different as night and day. They have nothing in common except for this highly unfortunate terminology that labels both capitalism. Part of the complexity of the discussion around this subject relates to the connection between the market and modern capitalism. Peter Riley remarks, "It has become commonplace to associate markets with capitalism, as if the two were intrinsically linked. However, the individualists challenged that notion and opposed the emerging corporate capitalism of their day. They argued that cooperative markets could only exist in the absence of the distorting power of the state, and through free currencies as the medium of exchange. Above all, the equality of each party in the process was to be ensured by extensive property rights. In doing so, they divorced the free market from capitalism, distinguishing between markets as a method of exchange and capitalism as a pattern of ownership." Given the permanent possibility of confusion involved in using the term capitalism, which entails the necessity for constant clarification, it might be advisable to adopt another term to describe the position which Meltzer finds so objectionable. Free market anarchism or libertarian anarchism are names that have been suggested and which find some use. Of course, changing names won't avert all criticism. Anarcho-capitalism by any other name would smell as rank to the Meltzers of this world. Noam Chomsky was once asked what he thought of anarcho-capitalism, and despite conceding that he agreed with anarcho-capitalists on a range of issues, appreciating their willingness to publish his material when no one else would, and being complimentary about their commitment to rationality, he said that a society foolish enough to allow its implementation would be destroyed. Anarcho-capitalism is a doctrinal system which, if ever implemented, would lead to forms of tyranny and oppression that have few counterparts in human history. The idea of free contract between the potentate and his starving subject is a sick joke. There are many futile activities and pursuits in this world of ours. State central planning and herding mice at crossroads are two that immediately spring to mind. But ranking high in the futility charts must be verbal disputes about whether or not a hotly contested concept really applies to this or that phenomenon. Is this really art, we ask, with a heavy emphasis on the really, attempting to smuggle in a judgment, it's not very good, is it, under the guise of a neutral classification. The concept of anarchy is one such highly contested concept, and many who identify themselves as anarchists are unwilling to allow others to describe themselves as such. We are really anarchists, they say. You are not. It is true that unless you want to end up talking to yourself like Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass, a term cannot be used to mean something completely at odds with its normal range of uses. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant, there's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument, Alice objected. When I use the word, Humpty Dumpty said, in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Well, the question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. But if words cannot simply be used just any old way, neither is it the case that words are a kind of trademark which some groups have an exclusive right to use and others not. In a 1996 interview, Noam Chomsky remarked that no one owns the term anarchism. It is used for a wide range of different currents of thought and action, varying widely. 8 years later, he was still of the same view. Anarchism is a very broad category. It means a lot of different things to different people. Despite Meltzer's prescriptive urges, the range of appropriate uses of the term anarchy is given by any good dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us that anarchy derives from the Greek privative prefix an, together with archos, meaning a leader or chief. It thus comes to have a root meaning of absence of leadership or absence of government, with, in its popular signification, the additional idea of lawlessness or disorder resulting from that absence. It can also mean a state of society without government, but without any implication that the absence of government and presence of liberty spells disorder. Somewhat more rarely, it can signify the absence or non-recognition of authority and order in any sphere whatsoever, for example, in morals or religion, and not only in society at large. Although anarchism is typically taken to be a doctrine that characteristically rejects the domination of people by the state, it should rather formally be defined as the rejection of any form of non-voluntary domination of one person or group of people by another. Sometimes, and by some people, it implies the rejection even of voluntary submission to the authority of another. Woodcock gives his working definition of anarchy as follows: a system of social thought aiming at fundamental changes in the structure of society, and particularly, for this is the common element uniting all its forms, at the replacement of the authoritarian state by some form of non-governmental cooperation between free individuals. If anarchism is defined as the rejection of any form of non-voluntary domination of one person or group of people by another, then it is an open question as to what modes of human interaction materially instantiate this non-voluntary domination. The commonest example of non-voluntary domination is, of course, the state, but it is not necessarily the only one. As we have seen, anarchists on the communist and collectivist end of the political spectrum, such as Meltzer, appear to believe that the institution of private property necessarily gives rise to non-voluntary domination, as does the relationship of employer to employee. Since I believe we are free to bind ourselves by entering into informal and contractual relations with others, even relations in which we voluntarily subordinate ourselves to others, I do not accept the common claim of anarchists from the left end of this political spectrum that such relations are necessarily anti-anarchic. If we are not free to bind ourselves, then our liberty is compromised and we are not really free. That form of anarchism that accepts this radical notion of freedom I call, for obvious reasons, libertarian anarchism. The libertarian anarchist has to be prepared to tolerate whatever arrangements may be arrived at by a particular social group, provided only that no coercion is used, and that the arrangements apply only to those who have freely signed up to them. John Sneed remarks that the function of an anarchist as anarchist is not to endorse any particular economic system, but to destroy the state in order to allow all economic systems to compete on a voluntary basis. Woodcock takes the denial of authority to be characteristic of anarchism, though not all who deny authority are necessarily anarchists. I'm not so sure that this rejection of authority is what is important. Certainly, anarchists reject the forcible imposition of authority from above, the assumption on the part of some that they are entitled to rule, to employ allegedly legitimate force against others. But there are at least two kinds of authority. The first is the authority of expertise. We might call this authority E. You believe what your car mechanic tells you because he knows about cars and you don't, or perhaps more accurately, you believe and hope that he has this knowledge. So too with your doctor and your dentist. They have authority of expertise, and you usually believe what they tell you because you usually believe they know more than you do about a particular subject matter. Others, however, have an authority that is not necessarily connected to any actual or perceived knowledge or expertise. It's merely a matter of the role that that person plays in a given social or political arrangement. This is the authority of office. Authority O. A policeman has this kind of authority. He may be an idiot or a genius. He may know a lot or a little. He may be helpful or arrogant. It doesn't really matter which. Whatever the level of his expertise, he has authority O. There can be no sensible anarchist objection to authority of expertise. We are free to accept or reject such authority as we see fit. But even authority of office, authority O, may be legitimate provided we subscribe to it voluntarily. If I join a chess club, for example, I become part of an organization with rules and regulations that I'm obliged to observe as long as I wish to remain a member of that club. Should I come to find the authority of office exercised in that club oppressive, I'm at liberty to try to change it for the better, and if I should fail to do so, I'm free to leave. No one compels me to be a member of that club. It is hard to see how anything other than the most solitary primitive life could be lived without some structures of authority. What should matter to the anarchist, it seems to me, is not whether someone exercises authority over him, but whether the authority that is exercised over him is one to which he freely subscribes. The topic that fundamentally separates anarchists into different types is their approach to property. Individual anarchists, and also, as we shall see, Proudhonian mutualists, tend to regard property, properly conceived, as a guarantor of freedom and non-dominance. Collectivist and communist anarchists, on the other hand, tend to reject the notion of property out of hand. Peter Riley notes the areas of agreement between these various forms of anarchism, but remarks that property was the ground of their divide. Individualism, he says, drew on an older tradition that viewed forms of property as a guarantor of individual independence and economic security, and as a device that ensured that the full value of labour was gained by the labourer. The distinction individualist drew was between valid and invalid forms of property. For communists, property was in itself a system of expropriation and an institution founded in injustice, which perpetuated exploitation. A standard criticism of libertarian anarchism is that it is a mere propaganda front for capitalism, the capitalism of big corporations, privileges, monopolies, and so on. This criticism is dramatic, but unfortunately inaccurate. Nothing could be further from the truth. Libertarian anarchism favours free markets in commodities, in labour, in capital, and in ideas. Free markets in everything. Blithely ignoring debates as to who is and who isn't really an anarchist, in what follows, I'm going to deal with the following thinkers: William Goodwin, who explicitly denies that he is an anarchist; Max Stirner, the apostle of egoistic individualism; Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and his mutualism. After Proudhon, I'll come to the terrible twins, Bakunin and his anarcho-collectivism, and Kropotkin with his anarcho-communism. Bakunin, the collectivist, substitutes for Proudhon's individual possession by voluntary institutions, while Kropotkin goes yet further, arguing for communism and attacking the wage system. Then come the American individualists, Josiah Warren, Lysander Spooner, and Benjamin Tucker. And my account will finish with a brief, indeed cursory look at the English thinkers, Wordsworth Donisthorpe and Auburn Herbert.